I always thought my life with Clara was something carved out of a dream, a quiet perfection that didn't need words to prove itself. We'd been together 12 years, married for 9, and built a home in the rolling hills of Vermont, where the air smelled of pine and the nearest neighbor was a mile off. I'm James Carter, a carpenter by trade, 38 years old, with hands rough from years of shaping wood into things people could love. Clara, 35, was a painter, her canvases alive with colors I couldn't name but felt deep in my chest. She had this way of tilting her head when she laughed, like she was catching sunlight just for me. Our days were simple. I'd work in my shed, she'd paint in her studio upstairs, and we'd meet in the kitchen for coffee or wine, depending on the hour. It was late August when I first noticed something off. The air was thick with heat, the kind that clings to your skin, and Clara had been spending more time in town. She said it was for art supplies, inspiration, meeting a new gallery owner named Victor Grayson. I'd met him once. A tall guy, maybe 40, with sharp cheekbones and a voice too smooth, like he'd practiced it. He wore a silver ring on his pinky and smelled faintly of expensive cologne. I didn't like him, but I trusted Clara. She'd always been mine, hadn't she? That day, I'd finished a custom table for a client in Burlington and decided to surprise her. I drove into town, the truck rattling over the dirt roads, and parked near the little cafe where she liked to sketch. I saw her through the window, sitting across from Victor. Her head was tilted, that laugh spilling out, but it wasn't for me. His hand brushed hers across the table, lingering too long. My stomach twisted, but I told myself it was nothing. Artists are tactile, I reasoned. She's just excited about her work. I didn't go in. I drove home, the table delivered, my hands gripping the wheel until my knuckles ached. When she got back that night, her cheeks were flushed, her eyes bright. She kissed me quick, said she'd sold 2 paintings. I smiled, asked about her day, but her answers were short, distracted. She smelled different. Not her usual lavender, but something sharper, muskier. I didn't ask. I didn't want to know. Not yet. The next few weeks were a slow unraveling. Threads I couldn't see pulling loose until the fabric of us started to fray. Clara's trips to town grew longer, her excuses thinner. She'd say she was meeting Victor to discuss a joint exhibit, something about blending her paintings with his photography. I'd nod, pretending it made sense, while my gut churned like I'd swallowed nails. I started paying attention to things I'd ignored. The way her phone buzzed more often, how she'd angle it away from me, the faint smudge of unfamiliar aftershave on her scarf one night. I'm not a suspicious man by nature. I build things, fix things. I don't tear them apart. But one evening, she left her sketchbook on the kitchen table, pages splayed open. I flipped through it expecting her usual landscapes. Rolling hills, twisted trees. Instead, I found sketches of him. Victor. His angular jaw, his hands, his eyes staring out at me like he knew I'd see this. One drawing showed him leaning close, her pencil tracing the curve of his neck. My chest tightened, breath shallow. I closed the book, set it back exactly as she'd left it, and waited. She came home late, hair mussed, claiming she'd been caught in a storm. The sky had been clear all day. I didn't call her on it. Instead, I watched her move through our house. My house, the one I'd built plank by plank. Like she was a guest now, not a wife. That night, she reached for me in bed, her touch hesitant, and I let her. It felt wrong. Like she was washing something away, not giving something back. I lay awake after, staring at the ceiling, the beams I'd sanded smooth mocking me with their permanence. The next day, I drove to town myself. Victor's gallery was a sleek little place, all glass and white walls. I didn't go in, just watched from across the street. Clara's car was parked out front, her red scarf dangling from the mirror. I saw them through the window, her hand on his arm, his head dipping low to whisper something. My vision blurred, not with tears but with a rage I didn't know I had. I drove home, hands steady now, a plan forming like splinters under my skin. I didn't confront her. Not yet. Confrontation is loud, messy, and I needed something quieter, something that fit the man I'd always been. I started gathering proof. Not because I doubted what I'd seen, but because I wanted to understand how far she'd gone. I checked her phone one night while she showered, the steam curling under the bathroom door like a warning. Messages from Victor, dozens of them. "Meet me at the loft," one said. "You taste like summer," another. My throat burned, but I kept scrolling. She'd written back, "James doesn't suspect. I need you again." The loft. I knew the place. An old barn Victor had converted into a studio, tucked off a back road. I'd passed it 100 times, never thinking it'd become a knife in my back. I put her phone down, wiped my prints off it, and sat in the dark until she came out, towel-wrapped and humming. She didn't notice my silence. The next morning, I followed her. She said she was going to the farmer's market, but her car turned toward the loft instead. I stayed a mile back, then parked in the trees and walked the rest. Through a cracked window, I saw them. Clara and Victor, tangled together on a blanket, her laughter muffled by his shoulder. It wasn't just physical. It was intimate, deliberate, a betrayal woven into every glance. I didn't storm in. I took photos with my phone, shaky but clear, and left before they could see me. Back home, I sat in my shed, the smell of sawdust grounding me. The rage wasn't hot anymore. It was cold, precise, like a blade I'd honed myself. I thought about our life, the years I'd given her, the trust I'd built into every corner of this house. She'd taken a hammer to it, and I'd make her feel the weight of that swing. Not with shouting or tears, but with something she'd never see coming. For days, I played the part of the oblivious husband. I cooked her favorite meals: roast chicken with rosemary, blueberry pie, watched her eat like nothing had changed. She'd smile, kiss my cheek, and I'd smile back, my teeth gritted behind it. I needed time to plan, to let the idea take shape. Revenge isn't a rash thing if you do it right. It's a craft, like building a chair that'll hold weight for decades. I started digging into Victor. Web searches, quiet talks with folks in town. He was a transplant from Boston, a trust fund kid who'd turned to art after a failed marriage. People liked him, too much maybe, but no one knew him deep. I found his ex-wife's name, Marianne, and tracked her down online. She was bitter, still raw from his charm turning cold. I sent her a message, vague but pointed. "He's at it again. Want to talk?" She replied within hours, spilling details. His lies, his wandering hands, how he'd left her broke and broken. Clara didn't know I was moving pieces into place. She kept up her routine, town visits, late nights, that musk scent clinging to her clothes. I let her think I was blind, let her dig her hole deeper. One night, she came home with paint on her fingers, claiming she'd been working late. I nodded, asked about her piece, and she stumbled over a lie about a sunset. I knew she hadn't painted in weeks. Her studio was gathering dust upstairs. Marian sent me photos next, old ones of Victor with other women, timestamps overlapping his marriage. I printed them, tucked them away. The plan was growing, sharp and heavy in my mind. I'd use her own trust against her, twist it until she felt the betrayal she dealt me. But I needed more than photos, more than words. I needed her to see it crumble with her own eyes. The first step was subtle, a seed I planted without her noticing. I invited Victor to dinner, told Clara it'd be nice to meet her collaborator properly, to see what they'd been working on. Her eyes flickered, surprise, maybe fear, but she agreed, too quick, like she had to prove something. I spent the day preparing, slow roasting a leg of lamb, setting the table with our good plates. Victor arrived at 7, that silver ring glinting under our porch light, his smile too wide. We ate, talked about art, the weather, anything but the truth hanging between us. Clara was nervous, her fork trembling slightly, but Victor played it cool, complimenting my cooking, asking about my work. I watched them, the way her knee brushed his under the table, the glances they thought I missed. After dessert, I suggested a tour of the house, my shed, her studio. Victor nodded, eager, and Clara followed, her steps hesitant. In the shed, I showed him my tools, my latest project, a rocking chair with intricate joints. He ran his fingers over it, impressed, and I said, casual as anything, Takes patience to make something last. You ever build anything like that, Victor? His laugh was thin, and Clara shifted beside him. Upstairs, her studio was a lie exposed. Empty easels, no new work. She stammered about a creative block, but Victor's smirk told me he knew the real story. That night, after he left, I kissed her forehead, said it had been a good evening. She relaxed, thinking she'd won. She didn't know I'd slipped a tracker into her car while they'd been upstairs. Didn't know I'd recorded every word at dinner. His flirty undertones, her nervous laughs. The evidence was piling up, but it wasn't enough. I wanted her to feel the weight of her own choices, to watch her world crack open. And Victor? He'd get his own reckoning, one that'd hit him where his pride lived. The tracker was a small thing, no bigger than a quarter, tucked under the passenger seat of Clara's car. I'd ordered it online, paid cash at a store 2 towns over. Every move she made now pinged my phone, every trip to the loft, every detour to Victor's gallery. The data piled up like kindling, dry and ready to burn. I didn't check it constantly. I didn't need to. I knew where she was going, who she was with. It was the rhythm of her lies that fascinated me. Tuesday afternoons, Friday evenings, the occasional Sunday when she claimed she needed fresh air. I started talking to Marion more, late at night when Clara was asleep. She was a goldmine of resentment, her voice sharp over the phone as she recounted Victor's habits. How he'd charm, consume, then discard. He's got a type, she said once. Soft women who think they're strong. He'll bleed her dry, then move on. I didn't tell her Clara was the latest. I let her assume it was someone else. But her words stuck, a splinter in my mind. Clara wasn't soft, not to me. She'd been fire and steel until him. One night, I followed the tracker's signal to the loft again. Parked half a mile out, I crept through the woods, the air cold and damp. Through the window, I saw them. Clara perched on a stool, Victor circling her with a camera, snapping photos. She posed, head tilted, lips parted. A stranger in my wife's skin. He touched her hair, adjusted her scarf, and she didn't pull away. I didn't take pictures this time. I just watched, letting the scene carve itself into me. Back home, I sat in my shed, hands idle, the rocking chair unfinished. The plan was solidifying now, a structure taking shape. Something elegant, brutal, permanent. Clara came home at dawn, claiming she'd been sketching stars. I nodded, poured her coffee, watched her sip it like nothing was wrong. Her lies were a performance now, and I was the audience, applauding silently until the curtain fell. I needed an ally, someone who'd help without asking too many questions. That's where Tommy came in. He's my oldest friend, a mechanic with a shop in town, hands black with grease and a heart too big for his own good. We'd grown up together, fished the same rivers, built forts in the same woods. I didn't tell him everything, just enough. Clara's mixed up with someone, I said one afternoon, leaning against his workbench. I need to borrow your truck for a few days. No plates, no trace. Tommy didn't blink. You okay, Jimmy? He asked, wiping his hands on a rag. I nodded, kept my face blank. He handed me the keys to an old Ford, unregistered, a rust bucket he kept for odd jobs. Whatever you're doing, be careful, he said. I thanked him, drove it home, parked it behind the shed under a tarp. It'd be useful soon. That night, I went through Clara's things. She was in the shower, humming again, oblivious. Her purse held receipts, coffee shops, a boutique, a motel I didn't recognize. Her laptop was trickier. She'd changed the password. I didn't force it. Instead, I found an old sketchbook in her closet, buried under sweaters. More drawings of Victor, but these were different, him lounging on a bed, her hand tracing his chest. My pulse thrummed, steady but loud. I photographed the pages, put them back. The revenge was taking form, a two-pronged thing. Clara would lose what she loved most, her art, her freedom. Victor would lose his reputation, his world. I started small. Anonymous emails to the gallery's clients, hinting at unprofessional conduct with attached photos of him and Clara, blurred just enough to dodge legal trouble. Whispers spread fast in a small town. I saw the first ripple at the hardware store, old Mrs. Delaney muttering about that Grayson fella and his carryings on. Clara didn't notice yet. She was too busy living her lie. Victor's gallery started to feel the heat. I'd sent more emails, dropped a few printed photos in mailboxes around town. Nothing traceable, just enough to stir the pot. People talked. Clients canceled. I heard it from Tommy. Grayson's losing bookings. Folks say he's tangled with some married woman. I shrugged, kept my voice even. Karma's funny that way. Inside, I was a furnace, slow-burning but controlled. Clara sensed it too, though she didn't connect it to me. She came home one evening, flustered, saying Victor was stressed about the gallery. People are so judgmental, she huffed, pouring wine. I agreed, asked if she'd help him through it. She nodded, distracted, and I smiled into my glass. Let her prop him up. It'd make the fall harder. I drove Tommy's truck to the loft that night, parked in the shadows. They were there, Clara's car, Victor's sleek BMW. I didn't watch this time. Instead, I slashed his tires quick and quiet, the blade sinking into rubber like it was flesh. I scratched a single word into the paint, liar, and left before they emerged. The next day, Clara ranted about vandals, her voice tight. Victor had filed a report, but with no cameras, no witnesses, it was nothing. I listened, nodded, offered to fix her car if she needed it. She laughed, oblivious. The tracker showed her doubling down. More visits, longer hours. She was clinging to him now, desperate to save what they'd built. I let her. I had bigger moves coming. Marion sent me a recording. Victor's voice, slurring, admitting he'd played his ex for years. I saved it, a weapon for later. The chair in my shed was nearly done, its curves perfect. It'd play a part too, though Clara didn't know it yet. Clara's art was her soul, or it had been before Victor. I decided it'd be the first thing she lost. I'd always admired her talent, hung her paintings in our home like trophies. Now they mocked me. I waited until she was out, then gathered every canvas from her studio, old works, new sketches, even the ones of him. I didn't destroy them outright. That'd be too easy. Instead, I drove to a storage unit an hour away, rented under a fake name, and locked them inside. Back home, I rearranged her studio. Empty easels, blank walls, a void where her passion used to live. She noticed that night, her scream echoing down the stairs. "James, where's my work?" she demanded, eyes wild. I feigned confusion, helped her search, suggested maybe she'd moved them herself. "You've been so busy," I said, calm as stone. She tore through the house, frantic, then sank onto the couch, sobbing. "They're my life," she whispered. I held her, murmuring comfort, my hands steady while my mind raced. She didn't suspect me, not yet. Victor called her an hour later, his voice tinny through the speaker. "We'll figure it out," he promised. I smiled, unseen. He wouldn't. The next day, I mailed a single sketch, his face, her signature, to a local critic, anonymous, with a note. "Ask Grayson about his muse." The critic ran a piece, subtle but damning, linking Victor's decline to a mysterious affair. Clara read it, paled, but said nothing. The cracks were widening. I finished the rocking chair that night, sanding it smooth. It was beautiful, a gift I'd planned for her birthday. Now it'd serve a different purpose. I stained it dark, let it dry in the shed, the smell of varnish thick in the air. Clara slept upstairs, oblivious to the storm I was building. She'd feel it soon, every gust, every shard. Victor's world was crumbling faster than I'd expected. The gallery lost its lease, rumors of unpaid rent, fueled by my whispers to the landlord's cousin at the bar. Clients pulled out, his name smeared across town like mud. Clara tried to shield him, spending more time at his side, her loyalty a twisted thing. I let her go, waved her off with a smile, knowing each step tied her tighter to the trap. I invited Marianne to Vermont. She arrived on a gray morning, her face lined but fierce. Over coffee in my kitchen, I showed her the photos, the sketches, the recording. "That's my Clara," I said, voice flat. Marianne's eyes narrowed. He's done it again. We planned together, her anger, my precision. She'd confront him publicly, use his past to bury him. I'd handle Clara, make her watch it all collapse. That night, Clara came home late, exhausted. "Victor's a mess," she said, rubbing her temples. I nodded, offered tea, watched her sip it. The tracker showed she'd been at the loft again, clinging to a sinking ship. I didn't care. The chair sat in the shed. Ready. Marianne was ready. I was ready. The revenge wasn't loud yet. It was a whisper, a shadow, but it was coming. And when it hit, they'd feel every inch of it. Marianne was a wildfire I'd lit but couldn't control. She stormed into town 2 days later, her rental car screeching to a stop outside Victor's gallery. I told her enough, showed her Clara's sketches, played the recording of his drunken confession. But she'd taken it further, digging up old bank records, letters, proof of his scams. She didn't knock when she arrived. She kicked the door open, her voice carrying across the street. I watched from Tommy's truck, parked a block away, the engine idling low. Clara was there, of course. She'd been helping Victor salvage what was left of his reputation. Through the gallery's glass front, I saw Marian thrust papers in his face, shouting about betrayal, theft, the women he'd ruined. Victor flinched, tried to push back, but she was relentless. Clara stood frozen, her hands clutching a stack of flyers, her face pale as milk. Marian turned on her then, spitting words I couldn't hear but could guess. "You're just the latest, honey." The gallery's few lingering patrons scattered, phones out, recording. I didn't stay. I drove home, the tracker pinging Clara's car still at the scene. She didn't come back that night. When she finally did, the next morning, her eyes were red, her scarf missing. "Victor's a liar," she said, voice small. "His ex," she said things. I nodded, poured her coffee, let her talk. She didn't confess, didn't apologize, just unraveled, piece by piece. I listened, my face a mask, while inside I tightened the screws. Marianne had done her part. Now it was mine. The chair waited in the shed, polished and perfect. I'd carved a small inscription under the seat. For Clara always. A lie now, but one she'd believe. I moved it to the living room that afternoon, set it by the window. When she saw it, her breath caught. "You finished it," she said, running her fingers over the wood. I smiled. "Thought you'd like it." She didn't know it was bait, a prop in the final act. Victor's fall was public now. A spectacle splashed across local blogs and whispered in every shop. Marianne had leaked everything. His debts, his affairs, the forged signatures on loans he'd taken in her name. The gallery closed, its windows papered over, his BMW towed for unpaid bills. Clara tried to distance herself, claiming she'd been misled. But the town had already painted her as his shadow. She didn't paint anymore. Her studio stayed empty, a tomb for what she'd been. I kept up the act, gentle, steady James, the husband who didn't see. I cooked, asked about her day, let her lean on me while she mourned her lover's collapse. But I wasn't done. The chair was key, a gift she'd trust. I'd rigged it. Not with anything obvious, but with a slow poison, a resin I'd mixed into the varnish. It wouldn't kill her. I'm not that man. It'd seep into her skin over weeks, months. Rashes, dizziness, a creeping sickness she'd never trace. A carpenter knows how to make it whisper ruin. Marian called me that night, triumphant. "He's gone," she said. "Left town this morning, tail between his legs." I thanked her, hung up, and checked the tracker. Clara's car hadn't moved from our driveway. She was upstairs, staring at nothing, her world shrinking. I brought her tea, watched her sip it from the chair, her fingers tracing its arms. "You're too good to me," she murmured. I smiled, said nothing. The emails I'd sent weeks ago had another wave coming. Letters to art circles beyond Vermont, tying Victor's name to fraud, dragging Clara's with it. Her reputation as a painter, already fragile, would shatter. She'd sit in that chair, feeling it all slip away, never knowing I'd pulled the strings. Clara started to fade, though she didn't see why. A week in the chair, hours rocking by the window, staring at the hills, and her hands trembled, her skin itched. "I must be allergic to something," she said one morning, scratching red patches on her arms. I suggested a doctor, offered to drive her, but she waved me off, too proud or too broken to care. I nodded, hid my satisfaction behind a sip of coffee. The resin was working, slow and silent, a revenge carved into her bones. Victor's absence left a void she couldn't fill. She'd call him, I knew, tracked her phone logs late at night, but his number was dead. He'd vanished, chased out by Marianne's wrath and my whispers. I'd sent one last package to his Boston P.O. box, care of a friend who owed me. The recording, the photos, a note. "Run far or she'll find you again." If he resurfaced, Marianne would finish him. I didn't need to lift a finger. Clara tried to paint again, dragging an easel downstairs, but her hands shook too much, her colors muddy. "I've lost it," she whispered, staring at a smeared canvas. I stood behind her, rested a hand on her shoulder. "Maybe it's stress," I said. She nodded, leaned into me, unaware I'd stolen her gift long before. The storage unit held her old work, her soul locked away where she'd never find it. I'd burn it eventually, but not yet. Let her feel the absence first. The chair became her refuge, ironic and cruel. She'd sit there daily, rocking, her body betraying her while I watched, quiet as a shadow. The town turned its back, her name tied to Victor's scandal, her art dismissed. She didn't suspect me, not once. I'd built trust too well, and now it was her cage. By late October, Clara was a ghost of herself. The rashes spread, her balance faltered, her eyes dulled. She saw a doctor finally, allergies, they said, prescribed creams that did nothing. I drove her, held her hand, played the worried husband while the resin did its work. She spent more time in the chair, clinging to it like a lifeline, unaware it was the noose. I'd sanded it so smooth, stained it so dark, no one would guess what lay beneath. Her career was ash. The art world forgot her, galleries blacklisting her name after my quiet campaign. I'd mailed her sketches, Victor's face, her signature, to critics and collectors, each envelope a nail in her coffin. Derivative, one review called her. Tainted by scandal. She read it, wept, and I handed her tissues, my voice soft. "You'll bounce back," I lied. She wouldn't. I'd made sure. One night, she broke. "I was wrong," she said, hunched in the chair, her voice raw. "Victor, I thought he loved me." I sat across from her, face blank. "You trusted him," I said, letting her fill the silence. She did, spilling it all, months of meetings, the loft, how she'd fallen for his promises. "I didn't mean to hurt you," she finished, tears streaking her face. I nodded, stood, kissed her forehead. "I know," I said. She thought it was forgiveness. It wasn't. I moved the storage key that night, hid it in the shed. Her paintings would stay lost, a wound she'd carry forever. Victor was gone, his life rubble. Clara was next. Her health, her art, her pride, all slipping through her fingers. I'd watch it happen, step by step, my hands clean. Winter came hard, snow burying the hills, and Clara with it. She couldn't leave the chair now. Too weak, too dizzy, her skin a map of ruin. Doctors ran tests, baffled, while I stood by, the dutiful husband. "Maybe it's the house," I suggested once, knowing they'd never look at the wood beneath her. She nodded, too tired to argue, and rocked, the creak of the chair a metronome to her collapse. I burned her paintings on New Year's Eve, drove to the storage unit under a moonless sky. The fire was small, controlled, ashes scattering in the wind. Her talent, her past, gone. Back home, she slept, unaware, her breath shallow. Victor surfaced once, a desperate email begging Marianne for mercy. I forwarded it to her, let her sharpen her claws. He'd never recover. Clara lasted until spring, a shadow in my chair, her eyes pleading for answers I'd never give. "I loved you," she whispered once, her voice a thread. I loved you too, I said, and it was true once. Now I felt nothing but the weight of my craft. Perfect, cruel, complete. She faded, not with a bang but a sigh, and I sold the house, the chair with it, to some young couple who'd never know. I moved west, started over, my hands still steady. Revenge wasn't loud. It was a quiet thing, built slow, sanded smooth. Clara and Victor paid, her with her light, him with his pride. I'd lost something too, but it didn't matter. The chair rocked on without me, a ghost of my making, and I was free.